So how did the changes in Boeing after the merger with McDonnell Douglas affect the creation of the 737 MAX? Well, it turns out that it did so in two separate ways. One, the decision to launch the MAX in the first place, and two, in the way that the plane's development evolved. Stay tuned. A lot of people in the aviation industry, including some of Boeing's own employees, have described Boeing's merger with McDonnell Douglas as McDonnell Douglas buying Boeing with Boeing's own money. That was mainly because over the years that followed, former McDonnell Douglas executives started taking up more and more key positions in Boeing's board and management, changing what used to be an engineering-led company into a company mainly focused on attracting and pleasing investors. In other words, the company's culture had shifted to its very core, with even their motto changing from working together to more with less, under leadership of executives like Harry Stonecipher and especially Jim McNerney. Now, there is a serious amount of background to all of the above, and I've already made two videos that you need to check out, looking at how this all happened, and I really recommend you to watch those ones first if you haven't already. But today I'm going to continue by looking at how these radical management changes at Boeing finally led us to the Boeing 737 MAX and where the company finds itself today. But to do that, we first need to have a look at Airbus. Now, as some of you might already know, Boeing decided to go ahead with the Boeing 737 MAX project in 2011 after they had learned that American Airlines was about to place a massive order for the Airbus A320 new engine option, or NEO. Now, that is broadly true, but it really doesn't tell the whole story. For one thing, Airbus had decided to launch the Airbus A320neo a month earlier, in December of 2010, and they were horrified when it first looked like Boeing would respond by launching an all-new aircraft instead. To really understand why and how Airbus actually came really close to getting things very, very wrong, we need to remember a few other things about that time. For one thing, back then, Airbus wasn't at all as economically robust as they are today. Remember, we're talking about back in 2010, at a time when much of the world was still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. Now, Boeing was also having a lot of troubles back then, especially with the Boeing 787, which was suffering from various delays and supplier issues at the time. But over in Europe, Airbus definitely had their own problems. They were developing the Airbus A350, while the A380 was still relatively young, and the Super Jumbo's problems and inflated cost was still weighing really heavy on them. Meanwhile, Pratt & Whitney in the US was busy developing what is now the PW1000G family, which is better known as the GTF, or the geared turbofan. And CFM, which is a 50-50 joint venture between General Electric and Safran, were simultaneously busy with developing the LEAP engine. Now, as I've explained in quite a few of my previous videos, a developmental leap in engine technology, which these new engines would become, isn't something that an aircraft manufacturer can afford to ignore. Because of course, for the airline, the manufacturer's clients, fuel is their main expense, so they want to be able to use these new and more efficient engines as soon as they become available. But how does a manufacturer make that happen? Do they launch a new jet specifically for these engines, or do they re-engine something that they already have? This was the question that both Airbus and Boeing have been trying to answer ever since these new engines were first announced. Now, for this part of the story, I'm once again going to turn to Leham News, which you should definitely check out. I'm going to link to them below, along with also Scott Hamilton's awesome book Air Wars, who goes into all of this in incredible detail. To start with, Airbus were worried about the Bombardier C series, which they knew was planned to use a version of the geared turbofan engine. So to counter that, Airbus were confident that just fitting similar engines on its A320 family would take care of that particular competition. But what about Boeing? Well, to understand that, we need to make something very clear about the efficiency gains of new airliners. You see, basically the vast majority of those gains in any new model really comes from the engines. For example, we now know that the raw efficiency gains from the old to the new engine generations of the 737 and the Airbus A320 families is around 12 to 14% depending on the aircraft. And knowing that, Airbus believed that if they would replace the Airbus A320 with a completely new design, they could hope for an additional gain of maybe 3 to 5% in efficiency at the very best. And that's if they were to develop a completely new, lightweight composite airplane with laminar flow, high aspect ratio wings and with certain electrified hydraulic systems, pretty much what Boeing did eventually with the 787. On the other hand though, the cost of developing that new plane to get those extra 3 to 5% maybe was about, well, many times more than a simple re-engine project. Airbus calculated that an all-new single-aisle aircraft would cost 10, 12 or possibly as much as $15 billion to develop, depending on how the process actually went. And by comparison, a re-engine variation of the A320 family would cost Airbus as little as $1 billion. So clearly, an investment in a completely new aircraft didn't really make a lot of sense, especially since, as a design, the Airbus A320 family was still relatively modern and had plenty of life left in it. But before making a final decision, Airbus had to get into the mind of their main competitor in the United States. Would Boeing come to the same conclusion as they had done when it came to a re-engine versus going all new? A lot of Airbus people thought so, but they couldn't be 100% sure. Now, obviously, the 737 was a much older platform set lower to the ground, which induced limitations on the size of possible re-engine options. So, was it possible that Boeing would finally retire the 737 and move on? Perhaps they could do so as part of a wider fleet development strategy justifying part of that enormous cost. Airbus knew that they couldn't afford to get this wrong. If they went ahead with the Airbus A320neo and Boeing instead went with something completely new, Airbus would likely score some early sales, but in the long run they could be in a lot of trouble. You see, those extra 3 to 5% of efficiency of an all-new design would definitely matter to the airlines and could potentially put them at a huge disadvantage as soon as that new Boeing aircraft became available. Now, we all know what happened in the end, but as it turned out, Boeing actually was working on something completely new around the time when this was going on. And what Airbus didn't realize was that this 737 replacement would have been something truly revolutionary. For example, it would have been a wide body. And I will tell you all about that after this. I often get the question, how is it possible for you to do all of the things that you do? You must be juggling millions of things at once, and it's true, but the secret lies in having the right kind of support behind you. That's where my wife, Sandra, and today's sponsor, BetterHelp, comes in. I've been sharing the benefits of BetterHelp with you for quite some time now, and when I finally made the decision to seek support, ensuring that I would be connecting with a highly qualified therapist was at the top of my priority list. As a pilot, I clearly understand the importance of rigorous training and qualifications, and just like how we must undergo extensive education, training and certification to be trusted with the lives of you guys, our passengers, it is crucial to have qualified professionals to guide us through these challenges that we face in our own personal lives. I chose BetterHelp because of how easy they make it to connect with a qualified professional therapist. Every single one of their therapists is licensed, has a master's or doctorate degree, and has spent over 3 years and 1,000 hours working with people just like me and you. All I had to do to sign up was to answer a few quick questions, and then they chose one that they felt was best suited to me. This is a lot easier than manually researching therapists in your area, trying to figure out what they specialize in, what their qualifications are, and whether they have availability that fits your schedule. To try them out, go to betterhelp.com/mentornow or choose Mentor Now during sign-up to get matched with a therapist and receive a special discount of your first month of therapy. Thank you, BetterHelp. Now let's continue. In the late 2000s, with Boeing 787 still under development, Airbus assumed that when Boeing finally decided to replace the 737, they would likely do that with something based on the 787. Because leveraging what they can from one aircraft to the next is something that both Boeing and Airbus like to do for obvious reasons. Basically, Boeing could almost take the 787 blueprints, put them in a copier at 80% scale and make an all-new composite 737 replacement, right? Well, as it turns out, not necessarily. Boeing did indeed consider replacing the 737 with a single-aisle design made out of modern materials, but despite all of the troubling culture changes that were now happening inside of the company, Boeing's designers and engineers were still looking for new ways to innovate. So what Boeing's designers had secretly come up with was a small widebody whose fuselage would have an elliptical cross-section with a cabin layout similar to the Boeing 767 in width. But this cross-section would also make its baggage hold space unusually small, and therefore it was more appropriate for a smaller aircraft. This relatively small cross-section would also mean that despite it being a widebody, it would still be as efficient as a single-aisle jet, if not even more. Now that type of design isn't really practical unless the fuselage is made of composites, since the cabin pressurization of a non-cylindrical design would require much more material and therefore more weight to maintain its strength. So carbon composite materials have an advantage in this regard, and Boeing's engineers really wanted to use that. This new aircraft was then planned to come in different lengths, with passenger capacities between 180 to 225 seats, and this would make it comparable to a Boeing 737-800 at the smaller end and to an Airbus A321 at the higher. In another recent video I talked about the fact that when Boeing retired the Boeing 757, the intention had been to eventually replace both the 757 and the 737 with an all-new design. So with that in mind, this mid-sized twin-aisle idea maybe starts to make a little bit more sense. Anyway, Boeing called this plan the New Light Twin concept, and by the time Airbus announced their intention to go ahead with the Airbus A320neo, Boeing had already begun to favor this new design, both over a new single aisle and over a re-engine of the 737NG. Now, Airbus was of course completely unaware of all of this. They obviously wanted Boeing to go ahead with the 737 re-engine because they were quite convinced that such an aircraft would be inferior, in efficiency at least, compared to their Airbus A320neo. Now, history has since shown that they were mostly wrong about that, because they apparently assumed that the CFM LEAP would need to be shrunk with an even smaller fan in order to fit under the 737's wings. And if that was the case, that would have obviously given the engine a lower bypass ratio and therefore hurt its efficiency. But as it turned out, Boeing eventually did find a way to increase the fan size of the LEAP 1 Bravo engines by increasing the length of the nose gear and placing the engines just a little bit higher up in front of the wing on the MAX. But at this point, early in 2011, none of this had happened yet. So, to the horror of everyone at Airbus, on the 10th of February that year, over 2 months after they had officially launched the Airbus A320neo, Boeing's CEO, James McNerney, told a group of analysts that we're going to do a new airplane. Now, this was still far from a launch at this point. McNerney added that Boeing was evaluating a number of options, but that they were leaning more and more towards a new airplane design. And if that became the case, well, then that aircraft would be planned to enter service at around the year 2020 or so. Crucially though, the Boeing CEO also acknowledged that 2020 was quite a long way away still, giving Airbus a pretty good head start with their Airbus A320neo family. But as I explained in some of my previous videos, that would have been precisely what the old engineering-based Boeing would have done. Being second to bring a product to market had been proven to not matter that much in the aviation industry as it had elsewhere, since a new, well-thought-out, well-engineered, efficient aircraft design could stay in production and be in demand for up to 3 or even 4 decades, as was the case with the 767, for example. So being a second mover, but with a more efficient aircraft than your competitors, was a strategy that previously had served Boeing really well. And that was something that McNerney probably had remembered, so despite his more with less strategy, he actually seemed to intend to follow this principle. But that was because he had also assumed that the airline customers that they had would accept this and just simply wait for them. It was possible that some airlines would have accepted that, but now Airbus decided to intervene. As Hamilton explains in his brilliant book Air Wars, when Airbus realized that Boeing was in no rush to mirror their move to re-engine the Airbus A320, they quickly developed a new strategy. Basically, Airbus would look for opportunities to do a giant Airbus A320neo sale, preferably with an airline that was a traditional Boeing customer. And they found exactly what they needed in American Airlines. You see, American had at that time precisely the right combination of a fleet of old and by now really inefficient MD-80s, plus the kind of financial position where a nice deal on a lot of single-aisle aircraft would really help them. And on top of that, they also couldn't wait another decade for Boeing's new medium-haul jet to arrive. Now, approaching American Airlines for that kind of a sale wasn't very easy because of some previous issues that you can read all about in detail in Hamilton's book. But eventually, the two sides got into talks about a sale of 200 Airbus A320s, half with the old and half with the new engines, plus another 200 options. When Boeing first heard of these talks, they initially thought that American would never go for that. They based that assumption on an old agreement that American had struck with Boeing earlier, stating that they would only buy jets from them. Now, that agreement technically wasn't in force after Boeing's merger with McDonnell Douglas, but when Boeing realized that American's talks with Airbus were actually serious, well, then they first reacted by threatening legal action based on that old deal. Eventually, though, they realized that one way or another this deal would likely happen, and that caused them to fall straight into Airbus's trap. In less than 48 hours, Boeing abandoned their plans for an all-new, all-composite twin-aisle mid-sized jet and instead switched over to Plan B, fitting new engines to the 737NG, creating what we now know as the 737 MAX. American Airlines eventually signed deals with Airbus and Boeing for 460 single-aisle jets on the 20th of July 2011, which was then the world's biggest ever aircraft order. Now, it should be said though that even before this happened, Boeing was already getting quite a lot of pressure from other customers, including Southwest and United Airlines, to re-engine the 737NG, giving it a common type rating with their existing aircraft. But there's no question that the American Airlines deal was the final push. You can actually see that if you take a look at the American Airlines press release about this event. You won't find 737 MAX mentioned anywhere. And that's because the agreement was done so fast that Boeing's marketing people hadn't even come up with the name 737 MAX by then. Instead, the aircraft was just referred to as the new evolution of the 737NG. Now, James Albaugh, the CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes in Seattle and also one of the old Boeing engineers in the company, had up until that point really pushed for the making of an all-new 737 replacement. And that was only for the high brass at Boeing's headquarters, which had by this time moved over to Chicago, to say no, which was a true sign of the times. But the really big and interesting question here is, would the old engineering-driven Boeing have taken Airbus's bait so easily? Do you think they would have jumped on abandoning the all-new 737 replacement just to avoid temporarily losing one big customer? Of course, that is really hard to know for sure, but we do know that even back when the 737NG was launched in the mid-1990s, it hadn't been Boeing's first choice. Instead, their original plan was the 7J7 with its open fan engines, and who, by the way, also sported a new twin-aisle passenger cabin, but without the elliptical cross-section, of course. In that case, the engine technology just wasn't ready yet, but it shows that Boeing, even more than a decade earlier, had been ready to jump at the chance of innovation, and I think that actually says something. But as I explained in the beginning of this video, the decision to develop the 737 MAX is only half of this story. The other half is how the design of that aircraft led to the two tragic accidents resulting in the death of 346 people back in 2018 and 2019. Now, I will eventually make videos over on the Mentour Pilot channel where I will look at the full technical side of those questions. But for this video, I will go back to Boeing's safety culture and how it changed in the years after the merger. As I mentioned before, Jim McNerney, the Boeing CEO from 2005 to 2015, liked to compare his management style to Darth Vader's. And unsurprisingly, he had fallen out with the Boeing worker unions after several bitter strikes starting in 2008. In 2014, when the machinist union contracts were up for renewal, McNerney came in swinging and negotiated painful concessions, including that union members would have to give up their company pensions.
It's a critical vote for a labor union, an aircraft company, and possibly an entire region.
And it's not difficult to see how this could have created some real distrust and resentment in a company that had been run under the motto working together just a few years earlier. This decaying confidence in the leadership and the ever stronger whip from above seems to have created an atmosphere where people would start working around problems if they saw that solving them properly meant delays and therefore slipping targets. This, the slip in confidence and the loss of the safety lodestar, is likely what ultimately led up to the problems that has plagued the 737 MAX ever since. And like I said, I will soon explain all of those in more detail over on Mentour Pilot. But the important thing to understand here is that this didn't all happen at once. It was a slippery slope. So there was not one single thing or person that could be blamed for what ultimately happened. Instead, there were many decisions taken by tens or even hundreds of people over a long time period, which, through lacking oversight, cost pressures and non-existing safety management systems, led to where Boeing finds itself today. Obviously, the two MAX crashes should have served as a terrifying wake-up call, but worryingly, the FAA's recent report on Boeing's culture seems to suggest that at least some of these problems, like the fear of retribution if employees would speak up, might still be present inside Boeing even today. And that is a huge issue. You see, those type of problems aren't like a faulty software in an aircraft system somewhere that can be fixed by a software update and a few weeks of testing. In the case of a cultural change, proving that it's fixed to the FAA, Boeing's airline customers and the general public could instead take many years. So, how will Boeing do this? Well, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that the first thing that Boeing has to do is to let its investors know that the financial recovery will now have to take a back seat for several years to come, likely beyond the end of this decade, while the company sorts itself out. That sorting out will have to start by Boeing doing their absolute best to woo back the people that should be their most powerful allies in this fight, their own employees. Remember that painful contract that Boeing's machinist union was forced to sign back in 2014? Well, it had a 10-year duration, which means that it's up for renewal this September. And starting already 2 years ago, this union told their members to start saving up money in order to prepare for bitter strikes when the time came. And this year, Boeing's engineers union is also telling its members to do that very same thing, since their contract negotiations are due in 2026. So not surprisingly, it looks like the previous years of openly hostile relations are now causing these worker unions to respond in, well, hostile ways. So repairing this situation and restoring something resembling the working together culture won't be easy to do. Dave Calhoun, the current Boeing CEO, is due to leave his position at the end of the year, but I am curious to see if he will actually have to step down even before that to let his replacement sign those new contracts with the machinist unions in September. Now, the unions want their pensions back and a seat at the Boeing board among many other concessions as well, which frankly sounds pretty fair to me. And while dealing with all of that, the next Boeing CEO will also have to keep suppliers and customers happy, whilst also convincing investors that aircraft manufacturers measure their success over decades, not by quarters. In the next few weeks, we will likely learn more about the candidates who might replace Dave Calhoun at the helm of Boeing. And I think that the most important talent that this new CEO is going to have is fantastic storytelling. You see, it needs to be someone who can convince their employees to once again rally behind the new vision of a world-leading Boeing, and also simultaneously convince Wall Street investors to allow them the time and money it will take to actually achieve that. And those stories should hopefully be told from a brand new company headquarters, somewhere in the Seattle area. Something that actually some news reports very recently are already alluding to. Now, I know that this might all sound a little bit like wishful thinking, but remember, Boeing had all of this less than 30 years ago, and it was working really well for them back then. Now, if you've liked this series and would like to see more, consider supporting us by becoming a Patreon, sending us super thanks, or buying some merch from the links here below. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.